Good day. Today is Friday, 21st February 2025, and we continue to witness the steady deterioration of relations between President Trump and his administration in the United States and President Zelensky and his government in Kiev. Now, one has to say that there is an awful lot of rumour and stories circulating, not all of which I take especially seriously. For example, a Finnish MP, a deputy in Finland, has come along and claimed that Donald Trump has informed the European leaders that unless there is peace in Ukraine, a peace decided on Russian terms, all American troops will be withdrawn from Europe. This completely contradicts the actual situation where the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has been trying to calm the Europeans by reassuring them that no such decisions have been made and that the United States has not made any fundamental compromises with the Russians to date and is not planning to do so. So the story from Finland is obviously wrong. There is another story circulating. It's all over the internet. It may be true, but I have not seen any formal confirmation of it, that Elon Musk is preparing to switch off Starlink, the Starlink terminals used by the Ukrainian military, from the 1st of March. If that does happen, it would be a devastating blow to the Ukrainian military, since Russian jamming effectively has made conventional radio communications by the Ukrainian army, if not impossible, then at least extremely difficult. And without Starlink, to say it bluntly, the Ukrainian military will have extreme difficulties managing to coordinate its various units and to maintain control over them in battle. Now, that is not impossible. There are things, something like that might eventually happen. Elon Musk, as I well remember, has in the past expressed frustration at the way in which Starlink was being used in the conflict in Ukraine. As I recall, he was concerned about the constant drain on resources and battle that had to be fought in order to preserve the system against constant Russian attempts to jam it. So it's not impossible that Elon Musk, who's had a skeptical view about the war in Ukraine for a long time, might make this decision. But again, there are rumours circulating that this decision has been made, but I can find no actual confirmation of them. By contrast, a Ukrainian official, a member of the committee, the Defense Committee of the Ukrainian Parliament, has now come forward and said that supplies of weapons from the United States are ending, that despite reports about 2 weeks ago that after a brief freeze, weapons deliveries from the United States had resumed, it seems, according to this official, that if not exactly frozen, the deliveries have been reduced significantly over the last couple of days. Now, given that information does come from an official Ukrainian source, I take it much more seriously. And indeed, it is consistent with what we're hearing from voices in Washington. Now, before I discuss further the deterioration in the relations between Donald Trump's administration and Zelensky and his government in Kiev, I would like to reiterate again the essential position which we are currently in. President Donald Trump was inaugurated President of the United States on the 20th of January after having won the election, the American presidential election in November. Donald Trump has always been a skeptic about American support for Ukraine in the war, and as he's made very clear on many occasions, he thinks that Ukraine has been receiving far too much support from the United States altogether, and he has said so many times. He said so when he was a candidate, and he has said so since he became president. He has, however, also spoken about trying to broker a peace in Ukraine. And he has also discussed, and this is the main purpose of his recent telephone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin, and it was also the purpose of the meeting between the Americans and the Russians in Riyadh. He has also sought a stabilization of relations with Russia, which had become increasingly fraught under Joe Biden and had come to close to a total breakdown. Anyway, he wanted a stabilization of relations with Russia and an eventual normalization of relations with Russia. And the reason he wants those two things is not because America has gone soft or is giving up on being a superpower or is about to capitulate to the Kremlin. It is because he's making tough-minded calculations of American self-interest. He is concerned about the challenge to the United States from China in the Asia-Pacific region and wants to transfer resources from Europe to deal with that challenge. And above all, he wants to husband resources in the United States, where he feels there are many social and economic and governmental challenges which need to be addressed and which take precedence over the conflict in faraway Ukraine, which he sees as remote to American national interests. So he wants a stabilization of relations with Russia, and ultimately he would prefer a normalization of relations with Russia. He wants to achieve the last because he wants to lift sanctions on Russia specifically. And this is now becoming increasingly clear. He wants to end the restrictions on sale and export by Russia of Russian energy products. And the reason for that, again, is not difficult to fathom. He is perfectly well aware that these restrictions on Russian energy, on Russian oil and Russian gas, the attempts to make trade in Russian oil and gas difficult in global markets, has had an upward effect on prices, not just prices for energy, but prices for pretty much everything else. And that has led to inflationary pressures, including in the United States, and lower living standards there, and complications for the American economy. And as a politician, he knows perfectly well that it was these price pressures, this inflation, that played a significant role in bringing about his victory against Kamala Harris in the recent US presidential election. And, well, we have seen further signs over the last couple of days of the wish by Donald Trump and his team to start easing the sanctions pressure on Russian energy products. A small event has taken place as we've had confirmation from the American media, I think it was Bloomberg, that this idiotic plan to try to lower the cap on Russian oil that can be exported on tankers which obtain their insurance in London. The current oil price cap is $60, decided in late 2022, early 2023, at the instigation of Joe Biden's Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen. Well, this idea of lowering that price cap even further, perhaps to $40 a barrel, which is what I've heard, one which was being actively promoted by the Biden administration in its last weeks, and which was still being lobbied for by some of the European states. I suspect Britain certainly was one. Anyway, that idea has apparently fallen by the wayside. The United States, Donald Trump, his administration, have made clear that they are not interested in this, and the result is that there is not going to be any change to the oil price cap. It will remain, for the moment, at $60 a barrel. So, Donald Trump wants to normalize relations with Russia. He wants to stabilize relations with Russia. He wants ultimately to get the sanctions lifted because he sees in Russia a big opportunity for US business. He wants restrictions on trade in energy, Russian energy, to be lifted because he wants to reduce energy prices, energy costs in the United States so that he can start finally to bring inflation down in the United States and remove the pressure on living standards there. But he knows that in order to be able to achieve these things, or at least he knows that in order to be able to achieve those things without provoking an excessive amount of criticism from the neocons and the Democrats and their supporters in the media, it would be best to have peace in Ukraine. He wants a deal done between Russia and Ukraine that would end the fighting, bring about peace, so that he can pursue his policy of normalization with Russia and can start to lift the sanctions and can start to remove the restrictions on trade in Russian energy. And of course, in addition, ending the fighting will mean that there will be no further demand from Ukraine, no further call from Ukraine for the United States to continue to commit scarce American resources at a time when already, because of the huge flood of weapons that the Biden administration sent to Ukraine, American inventories of critical weapons are now extremely low. Well, this is Donald Trump's purposes. I don't, as I say myself, find them at all difficult to understand. There's a lot of hysteria going on in the West at the moment. There's been another article, this time in The Guardian, trying to refloat the Russiagate allegations, saying that Trump is soft on Russia. It talks ominously of a pro-Russian clique within Trump's team, and names J.D. Vance as one of them. This is, by the way, totally and completely ridiculous. If you look at the members of Donald Trump's team, if you look at Donald Trump himself, the thing that they are, the way to understand them, is as American nationalists, people who are focused on what they see as the interests of the United States. They're not doing what they're doing because the Kremlin is asking them to. I mean, that is completely absurd. But anyway, we see that these allegations have been revived in The Guardian. We've had articles in the Daily Telegraph talking absurdly about how Europe is again facing a Molotov-Ribbentrop moment, the famous non-aggression pact that the Soviet Union and Germany concluded on the eve of the Second World War. Apparently, the meeting in Riyadh is all about that. None of this bears any relation at all to the reality of what is actually happening. The Americans want peace in Ukraine. They want peace in Ukraine for tough-minded, hard-headed reasons of national self-interests. They're talking to the Russians because, well, they want that peace, and the Americans also want normalization of relations with Russia. And of course, they understand that the peace, or at least they have decided that the peace must be one that the that the Russians and the Ukrainians agree with each other, because the alternative is a Russian victory. And they're trying to get the Ukrainians to understand this. And they are now becoming increasingly frustrated and angry at discovering something which I have been saying for weeks and months and even years, which is that Ukraine, or at least its leader, Vladimir Zelensky, and the Zelensky government fundamentally have no interest in peace. Exactly as Donald Trump said a couple of days ago, the Ukrainians, who are now furiously complaining about the fact that they have been excluded from the discussions that are taking place between the Americans and the Russians. The Ukrainians have had ample opportunities, many opportunities, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Istanbul, whatever, to come to terms with the Russians and to end the conflict with Russia. But they never have done. They've never sought negotiations with the Russians. They've unveiled instead victory plans and peace plans which presume either unlimited US military support or Russian capitulation, neither of which, of course, is going to happen. They've made every possible attempt that they can to lure the Western powers into a direct confrontation, military confrontation, with Russia in Ukraine itself. That has been the consistent stance that the Ukrainians are taking. And when Ukraine sometimes, when Zelensky sometimes talks about negotiations, when you unscramble and unpack what he is actually saying, you discover very quickly that he is not interested in negotiations at all. Because he always demands, alongside the negotiations which he says he will consider, he always demands things like security guarantees, Western troops in Ukraine, supplies of missiles. He talks about Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons, of being allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. He makes demands which the Russians will never accept and which are calculated to make negotiations impossible. Now, the Russians have found this out. They found this out a long time ago. They went through a long, complicated process in February, March, April 2022 of negotiating with Zelensky and his team of negotiators. A draft agreement was initialed based on Ukrainian ideas. The Ukrainians bragged at the time to the Financial Times about the enormous concessions the Russians had made. Actually, they were overstating things. The Istanbul agreement actually was very close to the kind of demands that Putin made when he started the special military operation. But never mind. Anyway, the Russians went through all that elaborate process, the agreement, and the Ukrainians pulled out. Now, obviously and unquestionably, the Ukrainians were placed under intense pressure by their Western allies. Boris Johnson telephoned Zelensky and said, "You shouldn't sign this agreement." Boris Johnson came to Kiev and told Zelensky, "Don't sign this agreement." The Americans and the British both told Zelensky that they would not provide Ukraine with security guarantees if this agreement went ahead. But Zelensky could still have gone ahead with the agreement nonetheless, or at least the Ukrainians could have done, at least in theory. There would have been, of course, massive opposition within Ukraine itself, something I will discuss shortly. But anyway, at least in theory, at least in the abstract, the Ukrainians could have signed the agreement, but they didn't do so. And a few weeks later, in September, in October in fact, Zelensky himself signed off a decree which prohibits negotiations with the Russians. A decree which he refuses to rescind, despite talking about negotiations. He refuses to rescind a decree which prohibits negotiations. So the Russians long ago discovered that negotiating with Zelensky is impossible. And of course the Russians, who have been on the receiving end of Zelensky's peace plan, which effectively demands their total capitulation, and the Russians who've had to listen to Zelensky's victory plan, his speeches about the victory plan, have long since come to the conclusion that discussions with Zelensky, negotiations with Zelensky, are impossible. And over the last couple of months, the Russians have gone further, and they've been casting doubt about Zelensky's legitimacy. They say that he has overstayed his time, that he's no longer the constitutionally elected president of Ukraine, and quite plausibly, quite probably, Putin himself has persuaded himself of the truth of all of the legal points that he is making. But to be clear, and to be completely practical about this, if Putin believed that Zelensky was an reliable and trustworthy negotiating partner, I cannot imagine that he would have brought up and discussed this whole question of Zelensky's constitutional status in the way that he is now doing. Anyway, the Russians long ago came to the conclusion that Zelensky is never going to sign a deal, an agreement, a peace agreement, or negotiate seriously about it. They now have, by the way, very, very serious doubts about whether the negotiations that led to the Istanbul Agreement were ever sincerely conducted at all. Kirill Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, after all, has publicly said that Zelensky and his people were simply stringing the Russians along, whilst Ukraine mobilized and also used the negotiations as leverage to get the Russians to withdraw their troops from Kiev, and that once those two objectives had been achieved, the Ukrainians themselves, without any prompting from Johnson or the Americans, had already resolved that they wouldn't go ahead with the agreement that appeared to have been initialed in Istanbul. I'm not saying that this is true, by the way. I'm simply saying that increasingly, from what I hear, the Russians themselves have come to think this. So the Russians have long since stopped thinking that Zelensky is remotely capable of negotiations. They watch his various interviews, the many interviews and speeches that he makes in the West. They listen to the way in which he constantly misrepresents things, the way, in other words, that he straightforwardly lies about the historical record. They see how manipulative he is and how he is constantly trying to extort or persuade the Western powers to just go on giving unlimited support for Ukraine until Ukraine achieves somehow its maximalist objectives, which, as I said, it can only do if it is able to draw the United States and the Europeans directly into the war. So the Russians long ago lost any confidence in Zelensky. What is happening? What has created the sudden crisis, if you like, over the last couple of days is that the Americans have discovered the same thing. They want the Russians and the Ukrainians to sit down, sort out a peace between them. The United States isn't particularly bothered about the exact terms of the peace, provided that it happens. And they are now realizing they're becoming incredibly frustrated because they realize that despite all the money Ukraine has received from the United States, all the weapons it has received from the United States, all the diplomatic support it has received from the United States, Zelensky and Ukraine are not willing to listen to what the Americans are now telling them and are completely in denial about the actual situation on the ground, the fact that Ukraine is losing the war. They won't acknowledge that the fact that the Russians continue to advance is a reason to negotiate in order to save Ukraine. On the contrary, they treat the Russian advance as a reason for the United States and Europe to step up even further military and political and economic and financial support for Ukraine. And the Americans have discovered something else, something which the Russians have also discovered, which is that Zelensky tells lies. So Zelensky, for example, has now been spinning tales about the way in which he rejected the proposal presented to him by the Americans in Munich, the mineral deal proposal. The Americans are saying that the accounts of the discussions with Vance and Rubio that Zelensky is now giving are completely untrue, that Zelensky basically lured the US Treasury Secretary, Mr. Bassent, all the way to Kiev, a long and dangerous journey which has to be conducted by train, presenting him, it lured him with this mirage of this deal for Ukraine's mineral wealth, only to find that the deal was not one that Zelensky was actually, in fact, interested in. And the Americans have been deeply angered by the way in which the Ukrainians have leaked the deal to friendly journalists in Britain and are now spinning it as a neo-imperialist demand from the United States to strip Ukraine of its assets. So bear in mind that this whole story, this whole idea of offering Ukraine's mineral wealth in exchange for continued support originated with Zelensky himself. If he never brought up the subject of Ukraine's mineral wealth in the first place, the Americans would not have demanded it. Not in the way that they did. It was Zelensky himself who suggested in the first place a deal of this kind. So the Americans, whatever you may think of the morality of a deal of this nature, anyway, they found that Zelensky, a little bit like he did with the Russians, strung them along with stories of deals about extracting minerals in Ukraine, got Bassett to come all the way to Kiev, then refused to sign the deal, then spread stories about the way in which he heroically stood up to Vance and Rubio, and then, of course, spread further stories through the British media about what a lopsided and predatory deal it had been all along. So the Americans are discovering, again, the kind of games that Zelensky plays. Exactly, not so different in a way from what the Russians discovered with the negotiations, the Istanbul negotiations. That Zelensky says one thing one day, says something completely different the next day, makes to you offers that look like they could be interesting and tempting, and then criticizes you and tries to put you in a damaging position when you appear ready to accept those offers. And then, at that point, having done that, walks away. So the Americans, unsurprisingly, don't like it. And they don't like the way in which Zelensky clearly is not interested in negotiations. He complains about the fact that the Americans and the Russians are talking to each other, which the Americans feel, obviously, is none of his business. But he still refuses to rescind his decree. He refuses to do what the Russians have suggested, appoint his own negotiator. He won't meet with the Russians substantively. He's given no proposals about how to do that. He's made no proposals of his own as to how the war might end. Apparently, Vance and Rubio, when they met him in Munich, told Zelensky that they were expecting him to come up with realistic proposals about how the war could end, realistic proposals that could be used as a basis for a negotiation. And of course, Zelensky is not doing that. Instead, he makes speeches about how the Russians are preparing to conquer the whole of Europe, about how Ukraine must still receive security guarantees from the United States, something that the Americans have already rejected. He still talks about Ukraine joining NATO. He says he won't step down as Ukraine's president unless and until Ukraine does join NATO and the EU. The Americans have already said that NATO membership for Ukraine is not an option. He says one day that Ukraine has been betrayed over the promise of NATO membership, that the Americans never intended it seriously, and then he goes ahead the next day and says that Ukraine should still be granted NATO membership. So the Americans are becoming increasingly angry, and we got an expression of that in Kiev, where General Keith Kellogg, finally did go to Kiev and did meet Zelensky there. Now, we don't know what exactly took place over the course of this conversation, but we know that there was no joint statement afterwards. We know that there was no press conference, there was no meeting of the media or anything of that kind. All of that points to the meeting having gone badly and hit a dead end. Because I suspect even Kellogg, who has been perhaps the most sympathetic to Ukraine of all Trump administration officials, has again discovered the simple and unavoidable fact that when you talk to Zelensky, you can never pin him down. He won't ever agree solidly to anything. He won't take any sort of commitments. He continues to come to every discussion with the same display of arrogance, manipulation, deceit, and all of the rest. And he continues to try to work his friends in Europe against you. Now, I don't know what Kellogg made of all of this, but the fact that he didn't get a press conference, he didn't give a press conference, and he didn't come away with a statement, all of that strongly suggests that Kellogg also is starting to understand what a difficult and impossible person to deal with Zelensky is. For the record, the only comment Kellogg has made about his meeting with Zelensky is this one, which he posted on X. A long and intense day with the senior leadership of Ukraine, extensive and positive discussions with Zelensky at Zelensky UA, but it is on X, the embattled and courageous leader of a nation at war and his talented national security team. And that then links to a statement of Zelensky's own. Notice that Kellogg speaks of no agreements, no convergence of views, no identity of views between himself and Zelensky and his supposedly talented national security team. He does call him an embattled and courageous leader, which is, I suppose, polite. But there is no hint in these words of Kellogg's that he achieved any progress, came away with any progress on anything. Well, other members of the Trump administration have been far more forthright. Obviously, Elon Musk has been saying absolutely devastating things about Zelensky on X, on Twitter X, and, well, others who are not, properly speaking, members of the administration, but who have some, shall we say, connection to it, like Tucker Carlson. Anyway, they have said some pretty critical things about Zelensky as well. But we do have a good insight of what members of Trump's team, this now goes beyond Trump himself, feel about their dealings with Zelensky. And importantly, this is now coming from the American media. Firstly, there's been an article in the New York Post. Now, the New York Post is a New York-based newspaper. It is very conservative. It is Republican. It strongly backs Donald Trump. It is, in fact, backed Donald Trump pretty much through thick and thin, just saying. And, of course, it gained celebrity in 2020 because it was the newspaper that released the information about Hunter Biden's laptop, just saying. But anyway, it has now provided us with this article which appeared yesterday evening. Zelensky's friend list dwindling in the Trump White House as peace talk tensions escalate. Best case is that he leaves to France immediately. Notice that all of this is going on even as Kellogg is meeting Zelensky in Kiev. This article appears as that even as Zelensky is meeting Kellogg in Kiev. And, well, it goes on to say this. Ukrainian President Zelensky has few, if any, advocates in President Trump's inner circle, as the pair's souring relationship threatens to tank Kiev's standing in peace talks with Russia. And then there's a great deal said about the kind of comments that have been exchanged and Trump's own personal feelings about Zelensky, which apparently have never been especially good. But then you go on to read that while the deterioration between Washington and Kiev appears sudden, one source familiar with White House discussions told the Post on Thursday, that's yesterday, it's nothing new to me. And we go on to read, the real question is, has anyone told Trump they really, really like him? Has anyone, in other words, who's had dealings with Zelensky from Trump's team, has any one of them said that they actually like Zelensky? Well, obviously, it's a rhetorical question. It suggests that none of them have. A second source close to Trump concurred with the assessment and suggested that the best case for Zelensky and the world is that he leaves to France immediately. It's interesting they talk about France rather than Britain. And then the New York Post goes on to say a White House official privately confided their anti-Zelensky views, telling the Post that, like the Pope, I'm no fan of someone who bans churches, referring to Zelensky's August law that outlawed religious organizations linked to the Russian Orthodox Church, which has close relations with the Kremlin. The official added that the Republican Party is a big tent on Ukraine and posited that there are people in the White House who have a traditional GOP view on Zelensky. That might be an allusion to Kellogg, by the way. But then we're told that this person did not suggest any examples. And then we are told that Ukraine's former advocates in the White House, including National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, have fallen in behind Trump to rip Zelensky and hold their fire on Russian President Putin. President Trump is obviously very frustrated right now with President Zelensky, Waltz said Thursday at a White House briefing, where he appeared to indicate a slowdown in arms transfers was taking place after a Ukrainian parliamentarian claimed that the weapons that were going to be sold have stopped being supplied. And then we hear that recent remarks by the US president show that he wants Ukrainian elections ASAP and Zelensky replaced by someone more negotiable. This can be some who Trump and his allies trust, military leader or businessman. Now, by the way, for the record, I understand that Viktor Medvedchuk was a businessman before. He became an opposition leader and then fled to Russia, or at least came to Russia, but just saying. Military leader obviously refers to Valery Zelensky, the former Ukrainian military chief, who is now in semi-exile in London, where he has been posted as Ukraine's ambassador. Just saying. And then we go on to read that Washington's insiders say there's no obvious contender whom Trump would prefer if Ukraine were to hold elections, as Trump and his allies, like Elon Musk, insisted this week should happen. So there's an awful lot more in the New York Post, but most of it is historic, and to some extent it's eclipsed by the even more devastating comments we're getting in Axios. Now, Axios is an interesting newspaper because it appears to also have been one of those newspapers that was getting financial help from the US government, but it still seems to have strong connections within the Trump administration. And despite the fact that historically it's been more aligned with the Democrats. But anyway, Axios has an article recently come out which says Zelensky's 5 moves that set off Trump. And we go on to read, Ukrainian President Zelensky angered Trump so much during the peace talks with Russia that Trump was on the verge of withdrawing American military support from Ukraine. 3 US officials familiar with the discussions tell Axios. The conflict between Trump and Zelensky escalated into a war of words between the two that scared European allies who are worried about emboldening Russian dictator, well, I said this was a pro-democrat newspaper, Vladimir Putin, and rewarding his brutal expansionism. President Trump is obviously very frustrated right now with President Zelensky, Security Advisor Mike Waltz said on Thursday. Trump and Zelensky have had an awkward relationship going back to 2019. And then we're told that 6 administration officials tell Axios that during the past 9 days, there were 5 incidents that angered Trump, Vance, Rubio, and Waltz. Taken together, one administration official said Zelensky showed how not to do the art of the deal when it came to courting Trump's support. And they said, Axios then sets them out. February 12th, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent met Zelensky in Kiev to offer a proposal that would give the US access to Ukrainian mineral rights in return for de facto US protection. The last is not true, by the way. Trump later told reporters Zelensky was rude and delayed his meeting with Bessent because he slept in. Then February 14th, at the Munich Security Conference, Vance and Rubio met Zelensky to get his approval for the mineral rights deal, but the officials said Zelensky surprised the Americans by saying he didn't have the authority to unilaterally approve it without Parliament. Then February 15th, Zelensky publicly rejected the deal at a conference. White House sources noted that his remarks to reporters that the deal was not in the interests of a sovereign Ukraine were markedly different from the more positive-sounding comments he'd made on X the day before. February 18th, as Rubio, Waltz and presidential envoy Stephen Witkoff sat down with Russian negotiators in Saudi Arabia to talk peace, Zelensky criticized the meeting for occurring without Ukraine at the table. An angry Trump then lashed out at Zelensky at a Mar-a-Lago press conference. And then February 19th, Zelensky fired back, saying the president lives in a disinformation space. Trump then ratcheted up the pressure by posting on Truth Social that Zelensky, a former actor, was a modestly successful comedian who's become a dictator without elections. And then we go on to read that the 3 administration officials say that Vance's comment to the National Pulse, a conservative media outlet, that Zelensky should have aired any complaints he had about the Americans in private with American diplomats. Anyway, the 3 administration officials say that Vance's comments was a not-so-veiled threat by the United States to walk away from Ukraine. And then we go on to read, Zelensky grew too accustomed to former presidents. In the White House view, Zelensky grew too accustomed to former President Biden's open-ended support for Ukraine's war effort, the full-throated backing of NATO countries, and the positive press that went with it. So he overstepped. And then there's an awful lot more rude things said about Zelensky. And we're told that despite the mistrust and the anger, Trump's team have continued negotiating with Zelensky and a new mineral rights deal that would be part of a peace agreement is in the offing. And anyway, one gets the sense. Great anger within the White House, within the Trump team. It extends beyond Trump himself about Zelensky. He won't do a deal about the minerals, but he's not so far showing any interest in doing a deal with the Russians either, even though that is what the Americans now want him to do. And the Americans are now broadly hinting that unless that deal is done, the United States will indeed walk away. And that probably explains the reduction in arms supplies to Ukraine that we are hearing about from the Ukrainian parliamentarian. So there we are. A crisis in relations between the United States and Ukraine, between the Trump administration and the Zelensky government. And I don't think it's going to get better, because I don't think Zelensky is capable of behaving in any other way. I'm going to say something here. Yes, it is true that Zelensky is a volatile, manipulative, untrustworthy individual. But if we're talking about negotiations and Ukraine's approach to negotiations, or to be more precise, the nationalist movement's approach to negotiations in Ukraine, Zelensky really isn't that unusual. You go all the way back, for example, and look at the story of the Maidan protests in 2013, 2014. I remember that as they became ever more violent, President Yanukovych, the constitutional president of Ukraine, the internationally recognized president of Ukraine, went out of his way repeatedly to negotiate with the leaders of the protests, the leaders, in other words, of the nationalist movement in Ukraine. He agreed, or he seemed to come to agreements with them again and again to de-escalate tensions. And of course, those agreements were never honoured. The nationalist leaders took whatever concessions Yanukovych made and then restarted the protests all over again. And then, of course, on the 21st of February 2014, Yanukovych signed a deal with the nationalist leaders, the protest leaders, brokered by the European powers, which appeared to call for a de-escalation of tensions pending new elections later that year. And immediately, as soon as Yanukovych stood the police down, as he had agreed to do, the nationalist leaders violated the agreement and overthrew Yanukovych. And, well, it was the same with the Minsk agreement, both Minsk I and Minsk II. The Ukrainians made all sorts of promises to abide by Minsk I and Minsk II, which of course they didn't. It was the same with the Istanbul agreement. You can even go, if you really want to go into the weeds on this, I can remember, for example, how over the course of the spring of 2014, all sorts of agreements appeared to have been made between the Russians and the Europeans and the Ukrainian president of that time, President Poroshenko, to de-escalate the situation in eastern Ukraine, except, of course, that it turned out that the Ukrainians all along were only biding their time to build up their forces in order to launch what they called the anti-terrorist operation. Taken in that kind of context, you could see that expecting Zelensky to break with that pattern, especially at this time, and to begin serious negotiations, is probably not going to happen. And I don't really see how this is going to change. I've always felt all along that, to the extent that people like Kellogg thought that it was the Russians that needed to be brought round to negotiations, that was always a mistake. The problem was always going to lie in Kiev. Now, I come back to what I've said in previous programs. My own sense is that Donald Trump really wants to be rid of the problem with Ukraine, as he basically made clear in his recent comment on Truth Social. If the Ukrainians aren't prepared to negotiate, if the Europeans aren't prepared to come up with some kind of realistic proposals to assist with the negotiations, then he will say that the United States has done what it can and will walk away. The bigger prize, the more important objective, remains for him de-escalation and normalization of relations with Russia, reduction in energy prices, bringing down inflation, and redeploying US power from Europe to the Asia-Pacific region to confront China there. Just saying. So Vance's threat, which is, as I said, implicit in Trump's recent Truth Social message, where he spoke about Zelensky needing to hurry up and get moving, or before long he won't have any country left. These are pretty heavy hints about the direction in which the Trump administration is going to go. Now, I have to say, I've seen this play out very much in this way before. I remember how during the Paris peace talks between the Americans and the North Vietnamese, the South Vietnamese, President Thieu of South Vietnam, went out of their way to be obstructive, and very much in the same way that Zelensky is doing now. The South Vietnamese at that time constantly reached out to create trouble for the administration, the Nixon administration as it then was, with political allies in Washington, trying to undermine the process of the talks. And we can expect exactly the same thing from Zelensky and his team in Ukraine. And of course, they are also doing whatever they can to keep the Europeans on side. And they have an enthusiastic supporter in Prime Minister Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, I'm so sorry, Britain, and of course President Macron of France. Notice, as I said, the way in which, in a somewhat contemptuous way, US officials are telling both the New York Post and Axios that the best thing, frankly, would be if Zelensky got on a plane and left for France. If Macron wants him, he can have him. And if it's Starmer who wants him, well, he can have him too. Just saying. The United States would prefer to wash its hands of him, even though they've no clear idea at the moment of who should take over. Anyway, there it is. I am going to say this. Sooner or later, this is going to hit the wall. It is not going to be possible for the Ukrainians to spin this out indefinitely. And given the feeling within the White House, within the administration, I can't help but think that the point when the Americans will say enough is probably not that far on the horizon. If it is indeed the case that in March, Starlink services to Ukraine are going to be stopped, well, I, for one, will not be surprised. Now, since I talked about the Europeans, I should say that the very capable Russian ambassador to Britain, Mr. Kelin, has come forward and has said that this plan that Keir Starmer has come up with of deploying British troops and all of the rest to Ukraine is a complete non-starter. The Russians will never agree to it. It's bizarre that the British and the French are persisting with this plan, and I wonder whether they really understand or have any real sense of the mood at the moment in Washington. I think that if Keir Starmer and Macron come along to Washington and say that, yes, they will send 30,000 troops to Ukraine and that those troops will act there as a peacekeeping force, but that they want an American backstop, and that they also want, as the Daily Telegraph is now claiming, the Americans to forward position fighter jets, F-35 fighter jets, in Poland to potentially provide air cover for this peacekeeping force. I think the Americans will be quietly furious. After all, the whole purpose of this exercise is to reduce American commitments to Europe, not increase them. And yet that is exactly what Starmer and Macron are proposing. Anyway, there we go. Now, I haven't been discussing the military situation in Ukraine very much. I have been saying in recent programs that the momentum of the Russian advances is accelerating. And I think some discussion, some more detailed discussion of what's happening is therefore perhaps necessary. Now, the first thing to say is that there has indeed been a significant increase in Russian advances. And the most important events, it seems to me, are now happening in and around Kursk region. Yesterday, Putin had some kind of conference with the military commanders, the Russian military commanders in Kursk region. He spoke by telephone to the commander of a Russian naval infantry or marine brigade in Kursk region, and he seems also to have spoken directly to the commander of a paratroop force. It's the paratroopers, apparently, who have just captured Sverdlikovo, this important village close to the main road from Sumy to Sudzha. And latest reports say that the Russians have advanced further and are now attacking the village of Lebiedivka, which lies close to Sverdlikovo, just north east of Sverdlikovo. And if the Russians capture that village, well, they would be in a position to move towards the road from the north. But it seems as if the Russians have also advanced south of Sverdlikovo and have advanced into Ukrainian territory, into Sumy region, and that they're now in the process of seeking to capture two villages, Bazivka and Novenka. And Bazivka lies just a few kilometers from this road, this main road, the main supply road from Sumy to Sudzha. Now, there was a long discussion of this whole operation in Redovka, and they said that the important thing about Bazivka is that there's this river, the Lochnia River, that flows through there, and there's a small valley in this area, and there is a lot, there's heavy vegetation. The area is heavily wooded. And the point is that if the Russians capture Bazivka and this valley and the wooded area, they would be not only be very, very close to the road, but they would have cover and they could strike vehicles that move along the road with anti-tank missiles and mortars. And they would also, of course, be strongly positioned to launch an attack in order to cut the road itself. So this clearly points, it seems to me, to a Russian plan to cut off the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region, to trap them in Suja, in Kursk region. The Ukrainian forces, most of them now, appear to be located in Suja itself. There are still Ukrainian troops trying to hold on to Malaya Lochnia, which is located north of Suja, but the Russians are closing in. If they capture Lebyedivka, which they're now attacking, and they also capture Cherkasskoye Porechnoye, which they are also attacking, well, the Ukrainian troops in Malaya Lochnia could potentially be cut off, and the Russians apparently now control a cluster of villages south of Suja as well. So we could be looking soon at a siege of Suja, a relatively small place, around 6,000 people before the war, but one where there are now very large numbers of Ukrainian troops, because Zelensky insists that Suja must be defended at all costs, and a place where the Russians are now coming very close to cutting off the supply lines. So it's not impossible that maybe in March we could see a cauldron developing, a real cauldron with thousands of Ukrainian troops trapped in Suja. There have been some relatively small cauldrons created by the Russians over the course of the special military operation. But the one that apparently is looming over the horizon in Suja, in Kursk region, looks like it will be by far the biggest. Now, of course, it could be that Zelensky will have a change of heart, that General Syrskyi will be able to persuade him to pull the troops out of Suja before it is too late. But that would be out of character, and given the pressure that Zelensky is under, one wonders whether he will want to order a retreat, which he may fear would make the British, the French, but above all the Americans, lose all remaining confidence in him. So that is one deteriorating situation. Now, elsewhere in Kharkiv region, the Russians appear to control now Volchansk, north of the Volcha River, the high area of the high-rise buildings, the various factories, the village of Tikha, all of those, they're now firmly under Russian control. The Russians regularly apparently cross the Volcha River into southern Volchansk. The Ukrainians still try to cross the Volcha River to launch raids into northern Volchansk, but this is becoming increasingly difficult for them. But so far, at least, even though the Russians have basically taken control of northern Volchansk, they don't seem to have made any serious attempts to push southward across the Volcha River to take the rest of Volchansk under their control. And that could be because the Russians have now conducted an incursion into Ukrainian territory in Kharkiv region, further south, in an area north of the Oskol, northwest of the Oskol River, not far from the area where the Russians have established their bridgehead, north of Kupiansk. And, well, there's speculation now that what the Russians are going to do is that they're going to link up all of these various forces. The Russian forces that are now north of the Oskol River, the ones who have just crossed the border and occupied a Ukrainian village and other territory close to the border, but also west of the Volcha River, and the Russian forces in Volchansk itself. Now, if that happens, it will be a crisis for the Ukrainians, undoubtedly. It would threaten all of the remaining supply lines that the Ukrainians have, providing supplies to their troops in places like Izium and Kupiansk and all of the rest. And it would be a crisis as well, a very difficult crisis as well. If all of that happens at the same time as the Russians create a cauldron in Kursk region and defeat the Ukrainian troops there, well, then we might start looking at a potential collapse of Ukrainian resistance in Kharkiv region and Sumy region. And that could potentially open the way for the Russians to move on towards Kharkiv, the great city of Kharkiv, and the other important city of Poltava, and ultimately perhaps Kiev itself. All very speculative, and maybe we shouldn't look too far ahead. After all, we don't know what the Russian General Staff's plans are. But anyway, these events continue to play out, and in the meantime, the Russians continue to advance along the Oskol and Zherebets rivers. They've now captured the village of Yampolovka on the Zherebets River, bringing them closer to Liman, just saying. And altogether, it looks to me as if, as the Russians move south along the Zherebets River, ultimately a cauldron could start to appear around Siversk itself, Siversk, which is this fortified town that the Ukrainians have been holding, and potentially the Russians could also start moving towards Liman again, pushing towards Slavyansk and the northern part of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation. Now, there have been many reports about the Russians having made further advances north of Toretsk and of having captured more territory in Chasiv Yar. As I said, I myself believe that Chasiv Yar will be fully under Russian control at some point in the first half of March. But along with these big events in the north, the other big events that are taking place continue to be in the Pokrovsk, Kurakovo, Selidovo area. The Russians appear to be in full control now of Andreevka. They probably captured most of Urakli, or perhaps all of Urakli, in the Andreevka fortified area. They continue to advance westwards from Selidovo. The Ukrainian counterattacks from Pokrovsk have now conclusively failed. The Russians control Kotlino and Pishanye and are advancing and appear to be close to capturing the remainder of Udachny, another village in this area as well. The Russians continue to press north from Vozvyzhenka, and they have started a major offensive from Velikaya Novosilka towards Guryapolye and ultimately the town of Orechov, even as other Russian troops, according to our old friend Vladimir Rogov, have now captured at least half of the village of Pyatikhatki in Zaporozhye region, probably all of it. But all of these other moves, they all seem to speak of a general Russian intention to advance on the city of Zaporozhye, on the Dnieper River. And there's a somewhat concerned article today in the New York Times saying that the Russians are now almost at the frontier, the border between Donetsk and Dnipro regions, that they might quite quickly now cross into Dnipro region. They're rapidly clearing all of the remaining Ukrainian fortified positions. And if they do advance into Dnipro region, apparently there are no major fortified positions to stop them until they reach the Dnieper itself, which they would probably do in a couple of months. Just saying, maybe weeks. Now, all of this is happening even as the Ukrainians continue to suffer very heavy losses. There's a brilliant series of articles, as I discussed yesterday, by Gordon Hahn on his blog, which you can find, which discusses the appalling state of the Ukrainian army. The incredible thing is that Zelensky in Kiev seems to show no interest in this. He is fixated on defending Ukrainian positions in Kursk region, but he doesn't seem to understand that this crisis is developing along the Dnieper River and that it could be terminal. Well, there we are. Now, there have been some very interesting articles altogether, just saying, and one of the most interesting, in my opinion, has been written by the blogger who I know only as Aurelien. Now, he's written a very interesting piece fairly recently about what happens after the war. Now, he talks about many things. He talks about military and military technologies in this piece. I should say that the title of his piece, his blog, by the way, is called Trying to Understand the World. The title of the piece is Stone, Scissors, Paper, or Europe After Ukraine. Stone, Scissors, Paper is basically a discussion of military questions. And I think I can summarize it fairly simply, though it goes into things in great complexity, which is that there isn't any prospect at all of Europe without the United States succeeding in matching Russia in terms of military capabilities. If the Americans leave, then there really is no way that Europe by itself or any state in Europe can match the reality of Russian power. And he's, it seems to me, absolutely correct about this. And he says that the fundamental thing that has not been understood is that the West has suffered a major defeat in Ukraine, that it's not going to be reversible, and that, well, as he puts it, a fragmented and abandoned Europe is therefore going to have to do some very hard thinking. We must hope that for the first time in a very, very long time, Europe will finally take Russia and Russian concerns seriously and move beyond the stark fear of the Cold War and the equally unreasoning sense of superiority that followed it. And he correctly says this is going to be a massive development and will require an equally massive political change, perhaps equivalent to that post-1945, when many existing political groupings were simply swept away. The epic sulk, and by the way, this piece was written before the Trump-Putin call and the discussions that have followed between the Americans and the Russians. The epic sulk, which he predicts the Europeans will experience and in which they are indeed experiencing, can only last so long when capacity for action is so limited. And he goes on to say that history suggests that in such situations, new political forces will eventually arise and find popularity. And then he goes on to say this. He says, Europe will find itself in a familiar situation, familiar to most of the world, but not for what were once the great powers of Europe: Britain, France, Spain, Germany, and all of the others. A series of weak states, those are the countries that I've just described: Britain, France, Germany, Spain, and the others. A series of weak states in the neighborhood of a large and powerful state, and on this occasion one they have deliberately alienated. Russia is not going to invade Europe, and he's absolutely right about that, but that's not the issue. The more existential fact of its size and power, together with the weakness of its neighbours, will condition political relations between the great power and the rest. Some Westerners find this hard to understand, but it is a fact, and so understood in most parts of the world. That is absolutely correct. If you look at Asia, you will see, for example, that there you have the Colossus, which is China. You have other states around China: Vietnam, Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia. Some of them are big countries. None of them is as big or as powerful as China is. Mostly, they understand that and have reached a modus vivendi with China, even though always they understand that the Chinese Colossus is next door, and they have to give thought to what it wants. That, by the way, as far as I'm concerned, describes a sphere of influence. Now, I don't think that Russia has the strength or plans a sphere of influence that is going to extend right across Europe. I don't think the Russians have any interest in involving themselves directly in the affairs of any of the big European countries, Germany, for example. But they will keep a watch over what goes on there, and countries in Europe, Germany, for example, will increasingly have to take into account what the Russians think. Now, that is not an unhealthy or an unusual thing, and as Aurelian says, classically this is done by the affirmation of borders and interests, and then he goes to make suggestions to some of the arrangements that might be made in order to think this through. And yet then he goes on to say that some of us thought that at the end of the Cold War it was urgent to find a way of living together with Moscow, but none of us had the status or influence to affect the policies that were chosen. And sadly, that is true. There is now another opportunity to make sensible decisions in a situation where Europe is massively weaker and the United States is effectively out of the game. Well, it's not entirely out of the game, but it is increasingly showing signs of disengaging. And Aurelien hopes that such decisions are often forced upon states by factors they cannot control, and whether they like them or not. Well, I agree with this analysis, and I think it's an insightful one. But I think he's also right that if we're looking at today's Europe, it will require completely different political forces to sort out. Now, just to summarize again, I am sure that sooner or later there is going to be a final breakdown in relations between Ukraine and the United States. I don't believe that the present government in Kiev is capable of conducting negotiations. There might be some means found to change that government. That is what the Russians are talking about. That's what they mean when they talk about elections. And the Americans have come round to that view. But that is a very, very difficult operation to pull off, and it might not succeed. And of course, it also creates the risk that it will bring the hardline elements in Ukraine to power instead. The people who Zelensky could not prevail against, which is why he was not able to agree various deals with the Russians, probably including the Istanbul Agreement at the end of the day. But if that doesn't happen, if the Ukrainians cannot get their act together and conduct negotiations, then the war will simply continue. The Americans, some Americans, Kellogg did it again at the Munich Security Conference, have been talking about renewed sanctions against Russia. But realistically, after the discussions that have taken place, the discussions between Trump and Putin, the meeting, we now know, by the way, that Steve Witkoff, whilst he was in Moscow, did indeed meet with Putin. And they apparently had a successful conversation which lasted several hours. The Russians have never provided a readout. We only know about this from Witkoff himself. But anyway, given the whole trend in American policy, which is to normalize relations with Russia, to try to normalize situations in the global economy by rowing back or easing sanctions, is it really imaginable that the Americans will increase sanctions on Russia? They might go through the motions of doing so, but it's scarcely believable anymore that they will do it with any conviction. The British and French might talk about going on to support Ukraine, but they obviously lack the means to do so without the Americans. And in terms of their military power, all of Europe can only scratch together a force of 30,000 men, and even then they say they need an American military guarantee, which they're almost certainly never going to get. So, barring an agreement between the Ukrainians and the Russians, which, as I said previously, would require a fundamental change in politics in Kiev, and almost certainly Zelensky's exit, it's likely that the war will go on and that the situation, the military situation, Ukraine's military situation will deteriorate. And that deterioration will get faster and faster as Ukrainian losses mount and as Ukrainian resources deplete. The Russians have now broken Ukrainian defenses in southwest Donbass. They are close to encircling Pokrovsk. Chasiv Yar is likely to fall in a few weeks. And a major crisis for Ukraine is developing in Kursk region and in the northern regions, not that far from Kiev itself. At which point, well, without American weapons, without perhaps the Starlink system operating, the Europeans will have to make some very, very difficult decisions. The problem is that looking at the political class in Europe today, looking at Ursula and Starmer and Macron and both Scholz and Merz in Germany, and even Meloni in Italy, it's very, very difficult to imagine any of these people coming to the kind of arrangements with the Russians that Aurélien is talking about. He says that new political forces would have to appear in Europe and would be likely to appear in Europe in order to make this restructuring, in the geopolitical restructuring, possible and to make it work? Well, maybe one would like to think so. I certainly would hope to see it. But I can't help but think that the present political class, incompetent, disastrous as it has proved to be, will not go quietly into the night. Anyway, that is my programme for today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and you can go to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.